Hello everyone and welcome back. I am Katie with Unity Gardens. I am the manager of our Giving Grove Orchard program. And today I will be talking to you about what to plant in your orchard and where you should get it. In our previous orchard workshop, we talked about whether or not you should have an orchard in the first place. So if you missed that one, feel free to go back and check that out. This series is made possible through the DNR's Community Urban Forestry Department, so huge thank you to them, and to Giving Grove, one of our orchard partners. So, like I said, we'll be talking about what you can plant in your orchard today. In our last recording, we talked about things that you can plant in your zone. So we'll be talking about Zone 6, Indiana, and we'll talk about what of those options you should plant. So here are some questions to get you started. First, and I think most important, is what do you like to eat? So even if service berries are super easy to grow, if you don't like the way they taste, if you don't like the way they look, you shouldn't plant them. So what will you eat a lot of? What can you preserve? What would you maybe share with others? And if you're thinking of something that's really easy maintenance, but you actually don't want to eat it, maybe it's not the right choice for you. Like we said, what can you grow in your area? So if you really love lemons, but you don't have a space to bring it inside in the winter, maybe a lemon tree is not right for you. How much space do you have? So some trees are much larger than others, so especially nut trees. We won't be talking a bunch about those today, but they'll take up, like a chestnut will take up a lot more space than a serviceberry will. So if you have space considerations to keep in mind, make sure you have those in your brain while you're making your decision. What level of maintenance and care do you want to / can you dedicate? So if you know that you won't have a ton of time to work on your fruit trees, if you know that you want this to be a kind of non-stressful hobby, maybe don't pick the fruit trees that are harder and more finicky. Whereas if you're like, I've got time and actually I really would love to have fresh peaches, go for it. And how picky are you about your fruit? So a lot of fruit trees are targeted by diseases and bugs. And so there are some trees, especially apples, that are easy-ish to grow, but the likelihood that you're going to have picture-perfect, market-ready fruit is low unless you put a lot of time in. So if you don't care that maybe you'll cut around some bugs, you'll have a lot more freedom and a lot less time you have to spend on maintenance than if that is really a concern for you. The other really important thing to consider when you're thinking about what fruit tree to buy is its pest and disease resistance. So most fruit trees are cultivars, meaning that we found a tree that produces the fruit that tastes really good or grows really well in our area or was essentially bred for certain traits. And once we found that variety that we really liked, we just made a bunch of clones of it. And what happens when you make a bunch of clones is nature evolves past you. So many of our apple varieties that we recognize from the store are really susceptible to things that are out in nature. So you really want to consider when you're going to pick your fruit trees, do you want this fruit tree that you recognize the name of, but is really, really heavily targeted by this pest or these diseases, or do you want a fruit tree that's easy to take care of? Because if you're thinking about apples you recognize in the grocery store, like your Honeycrisp, it's a really big example. To get that market quality fruit, they had to spray a ton of times. So is that something you want to dedicate time to, is going out in the fields and spraying chemicals to prevent that pest and disease damage? Versus do you want to pick this other fruit that people haven't heard of but tastes really good and you don't have to do as much work? For me, my answer is always going to be that I want the tree that is less work, that still tastes good, that doesn't require chemicals to grow well. So the other thing to keep in mind when you are looking at fruit trees and what to buy is that most fruit trees are grafted. And this is because, like we said in the last slide, most fruit trees are clones of that type of fruit that we really liked. So what happens is they take a cutting from the tree that we liked the fruit of, and then you'll graft it onto the rootstock of a different tree. Usually they're in the same family. So if we're thinking about an apple, you would take a cutting of that Honeycrisp apple, and then you'd surgically attach it to the roots of maybe a crabapple tree. And then you would sell that whole plant as a grafted fruit tree. And the reason you have to graft it is because apples are cross-pollinated. If you planted a seed from your Honeycrisp apple, it's carrying genes from that Honeycrisp, but also from another variety that the bee took pollen from. And what it'll make is anyone's guess, because it's 50% Honeycrisp, 50% something else. So you have no guarantee if you're planting your apple from seed that it'll taste good, that it'll grow well. And so instead we make these grafted trees. So the bottom section is called the rootstock, and the upper part, which is the clone of the tree that we liked, is called the scion. Now we've been grafting fruit trees for hundreds of years. So as many apple cultivars as there are out there, which there are thousands, there is many, I don't know, maybe hundreds of rootstocks. And they're all named really fun things like M116. So not catchy at all, very hard to remember. But people develop these rootstocks for different things, whether that's the height of the eventual tree, maybe it's for disease resistance, maybe it works well with the cultivar that's being grafted onto. There are so many rootstocks to choose from. And you can see the main consideration is that they vary in height. So when you go to pick your tree and think about that rootstock, they usually fall into 3 categories, and that's dwarf, semi-dwarf, and full size. And there are different reasons to pick each of those. Dwarf rootstocks are typically going to be the most expensive. They need support. So because their roots don't grow that far, which is why they're the shortest, they are not very strong. They don't do a good job at holding the tree. So if you have a windstorm, that small root system, very easy to just pull right out or crack the tree. So if you don't support your dwarf fruit tree, it might just fall over within a couple years. They're usually the smallest. They are the smallest, usually from like 8 to 10 feet tall. So they're great for orchards where you want your kids to be involved. If you don't want to have a lot of, climbing up and down ladders to harvest or to prune or to maintain, they're really easy for that. They're great for small spaces because they don't take up as much space. The downside is that they will have the shortest lifespan because the roots don't reach as far. So the tree just doesn't have the access to nutrients like it would with a larger root system. And if you're trying to avoid chemical use, because they can't benefit as much from those nutrients in the soil, they will benefit the least from a holistic care system. Semi-dwarf is usually what I end up planting. They're in the middle. They often do not need support. Some of them do, so when I go to purchase trees, I do look and see like if that rootstock does need support. Most of the time they don't. They'll grow to a medium size, so 13 to 25 feet. So I usually do have to use a ladder or climb the tree to do some maintenance, to do some harvesting, especially to do pruning, but they are not nearly as tough as maintaining a full-size fruit tree. And they have a slightly shorter lifespan than the full-size tree, but longer than the dwarf. Full size are going to be cheapest because they're just letting those scions root, so they don't need to get an additional rootstock and go through that grafting process. They will always be freestanding because it's the natural root amount of that tree, but because the root system goes so far, it can get much taller, which means it will almost always be over 25 feet. They will produce the most because they take up a lot of space. There's a lot of leaf canopy there, but they are harder to maintain, much harder to prune, much harder to spray, much harder to harvest from. Some rootstocks will also have resistance to specific diseases and pests and different tolerances for soil texture. So if you don't have soil that works well with fruit trees, there may be a rootstock that can help you amend that. And then you can also, if you're like, man, I, for some reason, can only buy this full-size tree, you can always control size with pruning. It sometimes is tough, but that is an option. So if we're going to go from easy to hard. The easiest fruit to grow is anything that grows on a bush. So avoid the tree entirely. Strawberries, blackberries, raspberries, gooseberries, honeyberries, currants, grapes. I think these are all easier maintenance because you can do it from the ground. And they usually tend to have less issues than fruit trees. We will do specifically a small fruits and berries class where we talk about raising all of these and the considerations. The only one that I don't think is easy is blueberries because blueberries need very specific soil. So if you have the right soil for them, wonderful. If you don't have the right soil, you shouldn't plant them, period. So probably not a shock to any of you who have walked down a street in South Bend. Mulberries are really, really easy to grow. They actually maybe grow like a weed, and that is something to keep in mind. Now, there are two types of mulberries that we see in Indiana. There's the red mulberry and there is the white mulberry. The red mulberry is native to Indiana. It has much better tasting berries, in my opinion. It will not spread everywhere, but they're pretty rare. And then there's the white mulberry, which is the mulberry that we see everywhere. And that one is invasive. One of the main ways you can tell them apart is the white mulberry will have glossy leaves and the red mulberry does not. If you're interested in checking this out, if you want to look into the Purdue Extension, they have a publication that you can find by typing in Purdue FNR 237 into Google. That will bring you to their publication where they go through how you tell the difference between a red mulberry and a white mulberry. Red mulberries are pretty rare in Indiana, but you can get a cultivar of a mulberry that will spread less than a white mulberry. They are really easy to care for. It doesn't matter how many times the deer eat them down, they just resprout. So they're pretty chill. They kind of grow crazy, so pruning is really weird, but they are really forgiving trees. So I really like them. They will last for more than 100 years. They are mostly self-fertile. If you are just getting a mulberry tree from nature, they are single-sex trees. So you have to figure out whether or not you have a male or a female. But in Indiana, there are more than enough mulberry trees that you probably only need to plant one in your yard. Pawpaws are super cool, and they are also native to Indiana. You may be sensing a theme. All of the things that are native to Indiana will be easy to grow in Indiana because they want to be here. And pawpaws are super cool because they are a host plant for swallowtail butterflies. So if you would like to see more butterflies in your yard, pawpaw might be fun. They will need shade when they're young because in nature they grow in the understory to start, and then they break through when they're older. So if you give them direct sun when they're young, they won't be able to tolerate it. So a lot of pawpaws that you'll get from responsible sellers will come with some kind of shade protection or canopy for their first couple years so that they don't burn. They do need really consistent water. You often see them in nature growing by not in ponds or lakes, but on the side of them. They like that easy water access. The annoying thing about pawpaws is they don't fruit very well without help. They are pollinated mostly by flies. That's why they smell a little ripe, is because that's the smell that attracts the flies. And flies can be kind of lazy, so it can be hard to get fruit set from them. The other thing is that pawpaws spread through their roots and they need to cross-pollinate. So if you have what looks like a thicket of pawpaws, you may think, oh my god, that's like 10 different trees, but they're all coming from the same tree. So if you had a fly go from one flower to another on that thicket, it wouldn't actually be cross-pollinating the pawpaws. So a lot of people who are growing pawpaws for fruit, they will go out and borrow pollen from another pawpaw grower and go out with a paintbrush and hand pollinate their blossoms in the spring. But it's really cool because it's the closest that Indiana has to a tropical fruit. Its nickname is the Indiana banana. It supposedly tastes kind of custardy, kind of like a banana, but maybe a combination of a banana and a mango. They're kind of weird. They're also not very shelf stable, which is why we don't really see them in the grocery stores. So if you want to try pawpaws and you really like the way they taste, one of the best ways to get them is to plant your own. They have basically no disease or pest pressure that I know of. Deer will eat almost anything, but when pawpaws are older, they produce this chemical that deer don't tolerate. So baby pawpaws, susceptible to deer. Adult pawpaws, not an issue. They will spread easily through root suckers, so you just have to keep an eye on that. Persimmons are the last of our native fruit trees, which means they are also pretty easy to grow. They are tolerant of shade, they do prefer sun, very few pest or disease problems. They grow pretty tall, so prune for height. They do need a male and female tree to pollinate. You can get cultivated varieties that might be self-fertile through grafting a male and a female branch on the same tree. There are both cultivated and native varieties. That's true for all of the natives that I've talked about today. Native varieties are going to do the most for your ecosystem benefits. So if you're planting because you want to support the ecosystem, because you want to see those native insects, because you like having that like native forest in your backyard, go for the native. If you are going for fruit and for taste, probably go for the cultivated version because they'll have picked traits that result in better fruit. I lied, there's one more native tree, and that is the serviceberry. The serviceberry is pretty chill. It is hotly debated whether or not the serviceberry is a tree or a bush because it does not grow that tall. They're native to Indiana. They are kind of the like Indiana native equivalent to blueberries. So I really like them because blueberries are not easy to grow in most parts of Indiana. And here you have a tree that's really easy to grow that produces really similar fruit. They're self-fertile. The issue that people run into is that birds really like serviceberries. So if you're trying to grow them for fruit, you got to keep an eye on it and pick really quickly. You can also use bird netting, keep those birds away. But yeah, that'll be the biggest issue you run into with the serviceberry. They also, if you're familiar with the Callery pear, which is invasive and puts out these beautiful white blooms in the spring, this is a great alternative to the Callery pear. If you're thinking about landscaping and want that white color in the spring, plant a serviceberry. So now we're getting into our non-native, but probably more recognizable fruit trees. European pears. They're pretty easy to grow. I have found that not a lot of pests target the fruit, so the fruit is usually like looks pretty good. They require a lot of pruning. European pears have this tendency to just grow straight up into the air, which is tough if you want good fruit and if you want good tree structure. So you need to do a lot of pruning and limb spreading for the structure early on. They are susceptible to the same diseases as apple trees. On their own, I haven't really seen it be a huge issue. If you're planting apples and pears together, you'll want to watch the apple trees because they will probably transfer diseases to the pear trees. They 90% of the time require cross-pollination. And what I have found is if the tree usually requires cross-pollination and there's a self-fertile variety on the market, it probably won't be as healthy or produce as large of a fruit set as the one that was cross-pollinated. I'm putting recommended varieties in a lot of this, but if you go onto our resource tab on the Unity Garden website, there's just a PDF of all of these. So you are free to go there and just look at all these ones that are recommended. I am recommending ones that have good fruit, but also have good disease resistance, so less likely to die on you and easier to care for. So Asian pears can also be grown in Indiana, which I was really excited about when I found that out. And the orchardists that I've worked with who have planted Asian pears that have gone to be able to set fruit and have now mature Asian pears say they're pretty easy to grow. So that's really exciting. So the fruit quality is pretty good, just like with European pears. They grow pretty similarly to European pears, so you'll want to be careful about the pruning and the limb spreading. But there's a lot of different varieties. Korean Giant is going to produce those huge ones, so if you like really want to wow your friends and neighbors, but because they have such large fruit, you will probably need to offer some structural support to the tree. So tart cherries, also fairly easy to grow in northern Indiana. They're really productive. They don't have as many disease issues. I will be going into disease and pest problems in a future class, so we'll go over some of the things that do tend to target tart cherries then. They are self-fertile, so you don't need to worry about getting another variety. Kind of the gold star standard is the Montmorency tart cherry. Should have mentioned this on the last slide, but if you are thinking about growing tart cherries, there's also a bush series of cherries called the Romance series that are really great. They are more expensive, for sure, but they are easy to care for, easy to maintain, produce really well, and the cherries are less likely to be eaten by birds because they get covered in the bush more effectively than in the tree. So would really recommend if you're thinking about tart cherries looking into the bush cherries. And now we get to apples, which is maybe the most popular fruit tree out there. what I found is that apples tend to be pretty healthy as a tree, but getting good quality fruit is hard. There are so many diseases and pests that target apples. Like when you look at all the fruit tree pests that are out there, so many of them are just for apple trees. So that is really annoying and something to keep in mind. So you really have to keep up with maintenance if you want good quality fruit. They do need cross-pollination. The nice thing though is you can plant one crabapple, which has a pretty long bloom period, and then plant a bunch of different varieties of apples. One of their biggest disease issues is called fire blight. So when you're looking at varieties, you really want to make sure that you are picking a variety that is fire blight resistant or is a non-vigorous grower. Fire blight does target like quick growth more effectively. So these are some of the varieties that do better at not getting fire blight, which can kill your tree really quickly. And lastly, peaches. So peaches are hard. They taste really, really good when they're fresh. So I do think they're worth it, but they are one of the harder fruit trees to grow. They require intense pruning because they only fruit on second year wood, and they grow really quickly. But what that usually means is that the wood is kind of weak, so it breaks pretty easily. So it is important that when you get fruit set on your peach, that you thin the fruits so that your branches don't break. There are also a lot of things that love to eat peaches, so it can be hard to get good quality fruit, and you may get a late frost in northern Indiana and lose all of your fruit. So there can be a lot of annoying things about growing a fruit tree, but I really do think it's worth it because a fresh peach in the summer is so good. They're also self-fertile. Probably the gold standard one that everyone knows is Red Haven peaches. I have had a lot of success with those, but there's some other really good options. And then there are some options that are better for storage. So if you're one person and you won't keep up with how much a peach tree produces, it might be good to look into ones that are a little bit more shelf stable. So that is all we're talking about today. Our next one, we'll be talking about where you can get your fruit trees.